Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. The President of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz, says a newspaper misreported him, saying that, quote, Hungary wants to count the Jews. Mr. Schulz did strongly criticise an incident when a radical nationalist Jobbik MP proposed the drawing up of a list of Jewish lawmakers. However, it does highlight the growing debate over the rise of the far-right group Jobbik. A report out earlier this month said that on the rise were desecrated Jewish cemeteries, Nazi graffiti and verbal and physical attacks on Jews. The European Union's Parliament has criticised Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, for not speaking out against extremist riots, rallies and speeches, while reports of violence against ethnic minorities are on the increase. Viktor Orban leads the ruling Fidesz party. He has insisted that his government is not anti-Semitic. He even addressed the World Jewish Congress earlier this month. He pledged to honour the memory of Hungary's more than 500,000 Holocaust victims. But at the heart of the debate is the Jobbik party, which won 17% of the Hungarian parliament in 2010 and has gained ground since then. It has also scapegoated ethnic Roma, as well as other minorities. Hungary is home to Europe's third biggest Jewish population. But what are we to make of the accusations of anti-Semitism? What about the rise of the far-right in Hungary? And how does this fit into the narrative of the far-right in Europe? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Colm O'Kennedy. He's a reader in law at UCL, and he's a specialist in anti-discrimination law. Also here in the studio is reporter from the Jewish Chronicle, Markus Daisch. On the line from Budapest, we have Eric D'Amato. He's editor-in-chief of the Hungarian news portal politics.hu, and on the line from Paris is Benjamin Abtan. He's president of the European Grassroots Anti-Racist Movement. Eric, the comments from Martin Schulz, was he overreacting? I mean, what's the real situation regarding this issue, this incident of the so-called counting of the Jews and how it's been reported?
It happened quite a few months ago, and there was some hemming and hawing over the MP, the Jobbik MP, who made the comments that he was, in fact, referring to the issue of dual citizenship, that is, Hungarian lawmakers who also may hold Israeli citizenship. So they were sort of slicing and dicing the meaning of that comment, but clearly it was an offensive and divisive thing that the guy said. And the party is pretty upfront about being a right-wing Christian nationalist party. But that said, I think it's very important to start out understanding that the Jobbik party's primary sort of ethnic enemy, if there is one, is much more the Roma than the Jewish minority. It's a party that's based in the rural parts of the country out east where there are no Jews whatsoever, and it's really an issue of sort of poor whites coming face to face with this Roma minority.
And when Viktor Orban addressed the World Jewish Congress, he didn't mention Jobbik, though. Do you think he's genuine when he says that Jews are safe there?
I think he believes that very much, and I have to say I'm not particularly spooked on behalf of the Jews that I know in town in any sort of real practical sense. There really isn't much violence, much more in other parts of Europe. I think for obvious reasons, people tend to focus on the situation here because you've got sort of Nazi-looking, right-wing white people. But as most of us should know, in Europe as a whole, when there is actual anti-Semitic violence, it doesn't tend to be sort of whites hitting Jews. It's Muslims. So I think it needs to be kept in that perspective that people are not, my Jewish friends, of whom I have many, are not afraid.
Markus Daisch, Jews in Hungary are not afraid.
Well, I'm slightly surprised to hear some of Eric's comments. I mean, obviously he's in Budapest and he knows the Jewish community there better than we do here from London, but certainly we've reported numerous cases of attacks and a lot of concern among the Jewish community for their safety. As Eric says, it may not be as bad in Budapest as it is in other European cities, but that's not necessarily to say that there's no fear at all or no concern. A couple of days ago, I heard some British Jewish delegates who had been at the World Jewish Congress describe their experience of being in Budapest and how they'd been warned not to walk around the city wearing a skull cap and how they had to be accompanied by security guards everywhere. Perhaps there was an element of overkill there. Perhaps it was erring on the side of caution and trying to stay on the safe side of things. But I don't think we should underestimate the level of concern that there is about Jobbik and some of the activity. And certainly I don't think that Prime Minister Orbán's comments at the World Jewish Congress necessarily went down as well as some people might think. That he didn't, as you say, specifically tackle the problem with Jobbik, and that's obviously a concern for Jewish communities, not just in Hungary but around the world, who are very worried about the growing threat and this general sort of atmosphere of toxicity that's growing across the continent, which, dare I say, is somewhat reminiscent of the 1920s and 30s.
Eric, can I get your response to that? Maybe Viktor Orban didn't necessarily condemn Jobbik in the speech itself, but he did actually condemn Jobbik in an interview with a Hebrew-language Israeli newspaper. So perhaps those sentiments should be expressed in the Hungarian media.
It's important to remember that Fidesz, which is a sort of center-right party, it wants to be almost a sort of single party in Hungary. And you know, party politics is quite rough here. And what they would love to do is make Jobbik just go away. So there's a little bit of footsie playing with the voter elements on the farther right from where Fidesz is. But again, they would love for it just to be destroyed, for Jobbik to be gone. So there's no great love lost between those two parties. But it's also very important to acknowledge and remember that Fidesz is a party that has Jews in it in quite visible positions. There are some creepy people also around the top bits of the party who have said some bad things, but really, you know, I think the head of the prime minister's office, and I mean, you know, there are lots of people who are open Jews in the government who just happen to be also Hungarian, you know, quasi-nationalists. Just to keep it in perspective, Jobbik is a far-right party, but Fidesz is not.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the rise of the far right in Hungary with Colm O'Kennedy, Marcus Daish, Eric D'Amato and Benjamin Abtan. Colm O'Kennedy, the party there, Jobbik, it has a considerable sway in Hungarian politics in the sense that it has 47 parliamentary seats. That's an awful lot more than any other kind of far-right party anywhere else in Europe.
Yes, for the most part. But actually the problem is wider than just the parliamentary strength, the growing parliamentary strength of far-right parties. Eric referred to Fidesz engaged in a bit of footsie playing with some of Jobbik's far-right voting constituency. And this is increasingly becoming a core problem across Europe. What we're seeing is centre-right parties, and sometimes even centre-left parties, indulging, shall we say, some far-right tendencies in many European countries, which has resulted in increasing levels of hostility directed towards Jews, towards Muslims, towards Roma, towards visible minorities. Of this issue of footsie playing is becoming actually quite a pronounced trend across the continent. And as a result, far-right parties are proving to have a greater influence than their parliamentary strength would necessarily indicate.
Benjamin Abtan, I mean, what do you make of Viktor Orban's pledge to honour the memory of Hungary's Holocaust victims? Is this just paying lip service?
Well, he's not serious at all, of course, because his acts and for numerous years have shown the opposite of what he pledged to do. He is the one who has decorated far-right activists. He's the Speaker of the House, has taken part to commemorations of a former pro-Nazi leader. It's the Fidesz, it's not the Jobbik. And more generally speaking, he's the one with his party who is little by little destroying democracy in Hungary, destroying checks and balances. So we have to look at his acts, and his actions are very clear. He's destroying democracy. Hungary today cannot be labeled anymore as a democracy because of Fidesz. And of course, when he decided to go to the World Jewish Congress, and a lot of people there were not at all happy about his coming, and there were protestations, of course he must not be believed, because we have to look at his acts. And his actions are very clear. It's not only the Jobbik who is leading to who is, of course, like a pro-Nazi or neo-Nazi party with a militia and who are killing Roma people and who are not sued after that. It's him who is destroying the justice, the independence of the justice, the freedom of the speech, and who is, by various actions, leaning to far right. So he's the one, and the party, the Fidesz party, is the one destroying democracy, and who is very leaning also to racism and anti-Semitism. And of course, when you destroy the rule of law, when you destroy the checks and balances, when you destroy the independence of justice and the independence and the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, of course, this can lead only to more violence. It can be verbal violence as against Jews. It can be murders as against Roma and the people who are linked to the militia of the Jobbik who who have been murdering Romas for numerous years have not been sued, have not been condemned. And this is why there are so many actions, including by the Commission, the European Commission, who is surely going to start infringement procedures against Hungary, because there is a general picture, big picture, which is extremely worrying about racism, about anti-Semitism, about democracy.
Markus Daisch, I mean, the fact that the World Jewish Congress was held in Budapest, I suppose, was a show of support for the Jewish community in Hungary. It would have been strange if the Prime Minister of Hungary hadn't addressed it, wouldn't it? I mean, it was quite significant. He did try to make an effort, didn't he?
Yes, he did. I don't think people should underestimate the fact that when the WJC went to Budapest, rather than, often its annual Congress is usually held in America or in Israel. To all of a sudden go to Budapest, this isn't even like going to London or Paris. To go there and show that solidarity with the Jewish community should perhaps make people realise how serious the problem is. It's very easy. We've just been talking about the politics behind it, and it does strike me that perhaps people are necessarily getting caught up in the party politics of it, which is understandable for Hungarian voters perhaps. But the realistic effect of all of this is you have to look at what's happening on the ground, and the effect on the Jewish community and Roma communities and so on is obviously quite serious. It's very easy to discuss the politics as though this was maybe the be-all and end-all, but realistically, day to day, there are problems for minority communities and the Jewish community there. And the WJC's decision to go there and take such huge delegations from around the world says a lot, I think. And Mr. Orbán obviously put him in a difficult position. He couldn't exactly avoid speaking to them while they were in his country. But obviously, he then, the comments that he made didn't go as far as perhaps the Jewish community would have liked to have seen him go. He obviously felt the political constraint there somewhat.
Eric D'Amato, if reports are to be believed, we hear about songs and far-right bands doing well in the Hungarian charts. Also, there was a theatre which planned to stage a play about a group of powerful Jews plotting the country's downfall. The play was eventually pulled after an outcry, but, I mean, this must be the only country in Europe which these kind of cultural events are deemed to be acceptable.
Well, I would say it's the only country in Europe, the biggest country situation in Europe, where this is happening, where white Christians are doing it. This is the most important thing to remember. You don't think that this is going on in the mosque down the street from your studio? I mean, it is only, I don't want to sound like an apologist for this situation, but it is singled out in the international media because of the associations with the Second World War. This is not where our great problems in the future are going to come in Europe. I am spending much more time, and I'll point out that this website, politics.hu, is actually in English. It's not a Hungarian language site, so anybody can look at it on a daily basis to see the gruesome ongoing story. The story is much more about the destruction of democracy and the checks and balances, as our other guest was saying, which are quite dramatic and quite out of keeping, I think, with what's going on in Europe, and much, much more dangerous. But ironically, we should keep in mind always that that the destruction of democracy does not mean that you will have more communal violence necessarily, or attacks on minorities. In fact, under the communist dictatorship, intercommunal violence was probably at an all-time low. So these are two slightly different situations going on. And if I sound like a Pollyanna about the ethnic one, it's because I think that it's more, it looks more dramatic.
Has this kind of behaviour been normalised in Hungary? Have, for instance, far-right rallies been accepted? Perhaps tacit acceptance is actually the most insidious form of anti-Semitism there is.
Oh, sure. I mean, if it goes on, if you have things all the time, it gets mainstream, but you're talking about a Europe in which 15% of the population in just about every country is or will be in a nationalist right-wing voting bloc. This is just a fact of life. I mean, we just remember in 2002 that Le Pen came in second in the French presidential election. So this is a fact of life that Europe has to deal with. It is maybe worse here in some regards, but again, I think it's more atmospheric than it's the way it looks.
I mean, is it easier for groups like Jobbik to gain a foothold in a climate where Mr. Orbán's political party has been accused of placing curbs on the judiciary and the media? The European Union is concerned about this political development, and this is a climate which allows parties like Jobbik to flourish.
Their great gains were made when Fidesz was not in power. Their great gains came in the by-election for the European Parliament in 2009, and then in 2010 when Fidesz was being returned to power. Fidesz were out of power for 8 years, and it was during that time the corruption and the malaise and the perception among not even right-wing Hungarians that there was a crime problem that you could maybe tar the Roma community with. That's what was taking place when Fidesz was out of power. So I wouldn't pin that on Fidesz. I just wouldn't. What we could worry about with them is that if they lose support in the next election, which is quite likely because they're doing all these scary things and also, frankly, stealing a lot of money, I think, you could make that argument, that they will then be forced into some kind of silent cabinet with Jobbik. So that's the threat with them. But they would like to extinguish Jobbik. They would like to get rid of the far right. It's embarrassing for them.
Colin O'Kennedy, what's your view on the sense of how does the European Union deal with this clampdown on political freedoms, for instance, the judiciary, the media? This is happening in the heart of the European Union.
Well, there are big concerns, as Eric has said, about developments in Hungary over the last 2, 3, 4 years. What's been interesting is that how the EU has been constrained in its response. The limits to the EU's powers in this respect have actually suddenly become very, very visible. The EU can focus on issues that come within its area of competency. So the EU is at the moment launching investigation, has launched a long ongoing investigation into independence of the judiciary, independence of the data protection office, independence of central bank governance. But these are in many ways quite technical, specific issues within a much wider range of concerns. But the problem is the EU is to some extent limited by its scope of competency. It can focus on these specific issues because it has clear ability to act on those issues. But its ability to deal with the wider issues about erosion of rule of law that Eric has referred to is actually quite limited. The Council of Europe, on the other hand, has begun to take a much wider investigative remit, but the Council is less powerful than the EU, and as a consequence it can only, if you want, cajole, encourage, put diplomatic pressure. It lacks the weight of legal authority that the EU could bring to bear.
And Benjamin Abtan in Paris, that's the problem, isn't it? It'll be an issue of sovereignty. Perhaps Hungarians won't want the European Union telling Hungary how to run its affairs.
I think the main point is the destruction of democracy and the lack of freedom of the development of the country. It's very worrying because now it's not only, like in Greece, for example, Golden Dawn, the neo-Nazi party, which is attempting to destroy democracy and doing racist acts. Now there are people at the power who are changing the system and who are moving from democracy to an authoritarian regime. I think it's the duty of Europe to defend the fundamental values, and these values are present in the treaty, which has been signed by Hungary. So it's the duty of Europe to defend these values. And when there is a government which is destroying democracy, it's the objective of the European Union to defend its fundamental values. Otherwise, there will be no sense and no meaning to Europe, and because it's their duty, because of the treaty. So this is why people are doing also at the European Parliament level. There's going to be a very wide and deep report, which has been done by Mr. Tavares, who will be voted in next week. Also a very wide one, as one of the Council of Europe. We'll tackle all the issues regarding rule of law and democracy in Hungary. And this is why, for the first time since Jörg Haider and Austria, we speak about the use of Article 7 in order to prevent Hungary to have a right of vote, because there's been destruction of democracy by the rulers of the country. It is important for Hungary and for all the Hungarians. It is also important, of course, for all the other countries in Europe who may be tempted by non-democratic frame of mind by going to authoritarian regime. The message from the European Union and from all the member states must be very clear. If you want to be in the European Union, there are rules to respect, and these rules are the fundamental values, so you have to stick to democracy. So what is at stake in Hungary today is not only for all the Hungarians, for their freedom, for the political system, for their sovereignty. Otherwise, sovereignty will not be for the elections, but in the system. In the states, it will be, it's about the democracy and the freedom for all the other ones.
Can I turn to Eric D'Amato in Budapest? Benjamin uses the word authoritarianism there. I mean, do you see it in that strong a term?
Oh, well, I think we're on the way, sure. And I think that's going to be seen in a lot of other countries where you have fraying, economies and so forth. I mean, again, let's look at Italy, which had a government that had not a single elected member for several months. We have to look at the ironies. I mean, Benjamin is talking about democracy. Now, my greatest interest here is in democracy and the rule of law and an open government, let's say. But we have to understand that if you're going to do things like crack down on the radical right, that's going to mean suspending some aspects of democracy. I mean, when the World Jewish Congress was here, a lot of people were saying, to the Orban government, you've got to do something about this party. You've got to shut this party down. You have to have them stop talking. Well, they were a duly elected party. They got 17% of the vote. So it's a much more difficult situation than a lot of people think, and there are a lot of ironies involved in this. Democracy is a great thing, but democracy means a degree of mistake-making by individuals.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the rise of the far right in Hungary. With me in the studio is Colm O'Kennedy, anti-discrimination law specialist and a reader-in-law at UCL. Also here in the studio is Jewish Chronicle reporter Marcus Daisch. On the line from Budapest, Eric D'Amato, editor-in-chief of the English-language Hungarian news portal politics.hu. And on the line from Paris, Benjamin Abtan, president of the European Grassroots Anti-Racist Movement. Marcus, what do you make of that? I mean, we've mentioned there the Golden Dawn Party in Greece that has 18 seats in Parliament, and in Bulgaria there's the Ataka Party which has 23 seats, and I mentioned earlier on Jobbik which has 47 parliamentary seats. These are significant parties that have a democratic mandate. I mean, how does that fit in with what your newspaper would like to see?
Well, I'm listening to my fellow panellists talk about the democratic side of this, and obviously there are concerns there, but certainly what we've experienced in the reports that we've had from across Europe and the concerns of Jewish communities across Europe is something more realistic on the ground, which does move slightly away from the concerns about democratic curbs. We have to look at a situation, as you say, where we've got parties democratically elected in a number of countries, and also this atmosphere of rising anti-Semitism, rising Islamophobia across Europe, and not just in Eastern Europe. There are serious problems in France as well, where we've seen, not by far-right parties, but by essentially Muslim terrorists, attacks on Jewish schools, killing Jewish school children in Toulouse. This is what's really worrying the minority communities, and I appreciate that we have to pay some attention to the democratic side of it. We're not hearing a lot of, and what Jewish communities aren't hearing a lot of, is the EU explaining what they're going to do about this and how they're going to tackle these problems of attacks on Jews and attacks on Roma and attacks on Muslims. And that brings a lot of concern for people. You could tackle a lot of the problems in Hungary, I think, by doing some work on the education side of things. There's been very little, as far as I understand, education in Hungary about the Holocaust and attempts to tackle some of the war guilt that exists there. There's some quite horrifying statistics on the number and the percentage of young Hungarians who understand what happened 70 years ago. I don't see it. I think we've had very little coverage in the newspaper of communities across Europe seeing the EU doing anything to tackle those problems, which I appreciate is away from the political side of it, which is obviously a big problem that has to be tackled as well. But in terms of the education and the security issues, there are huge problems here that just aren't being dealt with.
Colm O'Kennedy, the idea of the European Union's role is obviously expressed there by Benjamin as well as by Marcus. But, I mean, how likely is that? And especially given we have effectively a twin problem here. We have a rise of attacks on minorities, but we also have the rolling back of some kinds of aspects of democracy.
Yes, this is a really, really tricky situation for the EU. It's, in a way, the EU is supposed to be guaranteeing individual rights and minority rights all across Europe. In another sense, its powers to do so, its actual legal enforcement powers, are very limited because states haven't given the EU that many powers in this respect. And what they can do is actually quite ambiguous. And Benjamin mentioned suspension of voting rights. That, at the end of the day, is the worst the EU can do in key respects. Which isn't at the end of the day going to solve the problem, isn't going to make the fundamental changes that Marcus correctly has identified are necessary. So there is an issue here of the EU-wide expectations being vested in the EU, which the nation states haven't given the EU the capacity to protect minority rights in the way that people want them to act. So there is this interesting tension. On the issue of democracy versus minority rights, this is an age-old tension, of course. What is clear is that for democracy to function meaningfully in the long term, you do need individual rights to be protected through the EU, through the European Convention on Human Rights and so on. But what nation states across Europe need to be doing is giving the pan-European institutions the teeth to start protecting minority rights in a much more effective manner than they can do at the moment.
Benjamin, can I get your response to that, please?
Key issue regarding democracy, regarding what you said, sovereignty. And democracy is sovereignty of the people. When you say there is an intervention of European Union to fight for democracy, to have rule of law respected, it will be something against sovereignty of Hungary. It will be something for the sovereignty of the people of Hungary, because all the numerous changes which have been made by Fidesz have led to the situation that it's not the elections who decide who has the power. And this means that there is no more sovereignty from the people. So this is what the European Union has to fight for. Speaking about Article 7, but we have to take into account the instrumentalizations by Fidesz, which can occur, of course. This has to be taken into account very seriously. But to fight very seriously, to have a lot of fundamental values and procedures regarding justice, regarding the press, regarding the separation of the powers to be respected, because what is at stake is sovereignty of the people, meaning their freedom. All the reforms made by Fidesz made it that this or that person or this or that administration created, which make it impossible for the power to change depending on the elections. And this is not democracy, it is not either sovereignty.
Eric D'Amato in Budapest, can I just ask you, you mentioned earlier on that the bigger scapegoat for the Jobbik party are Roma, but in terms of Jews, I mean, are they coming to a point where they're feeling that they will have to eventually leave the country? Or
people are leaving the country because the country is becoming less prosperous. What was far and away the most prosperous country in the post-Soviet space is moving down the rankings every year. People leave because there aren't economic opportunities. I know Jews who have left, but it's primarily an economic migration and a sense of that things are going the wrong way. These communal violence issues are not huge. What is huge, a bigger one, is with the Roma. And again, it's not really in Budapest, in the place where the opinions are made in this country. It's out east. And you have a three-way communal standoff, sort of normal white or whatever Hungarians, the Roma, and then a small number of Jews who are basically in Budapest. And they get along probably better than at any time in history. But you will always have some tensions. But the country as a whole, and its situation, its economy, its political situation, is a different story. It's a different story, and it's a far more alarming one. And then just going back to the EU very quickly and what it could do, Article 7 and the suspension of voting rights, I think, is almost laughably quaint. And if it were invoked, would only be almost a gift to the leadership here in terms of something that wouldn't really hurt them. What would really hurt them is if they couldn't open a new road or project every week that was 99% paid for by the EU. The inability of the EU to actually target structural funds and project funds for countries I just find ridiculous when you see how much political capital is extracted from these billions of euros of handouts every year.
Thank you very much. That's Eric D'Amato on the line from Budapest. He's the editor-in-chief of the Hungarian news portal, which is in English, politics.hu. Also on the line from Paris, Benjamin Aptan, president of the European grassroots anti-racist movement here in the studio, reporter from the Jewish Chronicle, Marcus Daish, and Colm O'Kennedy, who is an anti-discrimination law specialist and a reader in law at UCL. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London. Discrimination law. Also here in the studio is reporter from the Jewish Chronicle, Marcus Daish. On the line from Budapest, we have Eric D'Amato. He's editor-in-chief of the Hungarian news portal, politics.hu. And on the line from Paris is Benjamin Aptan. He's president of the European grassroots anti-racist movement. Eric, the comments from Martin Schulz, was he overreacting? I mean, what's the real situation regarding this issue, this incident of the so-called counting of the Jews and how it's been reported?
It happened quite a few months ago, and there was some hemming and hawing over the MP, the Jobbik MP, who made the comments that he was in fact referring to the issue of dual citizenship, that is, Hungarian lawmakers who also may hold Israeli citizenship. So they were sort of slicing and dicing the meaning of that comment, but clear
rallies and speeches, while reports of violence against ethnic minorities are on the increase. Viktor Orban leads the ruling Fidesz party. He has insisted that his government is not anti-Semitic. He even addressed the World Jewish Congress earlier this month. He pledged to honour the memory of Hungary's more than 500,000 Holocaust victims. But at the heart of the debate is the Jobbik party, which won 17% of the Hungarian parliament in 2010 and has gained ground since then. It has also scapegoated ethnic Roma, as well as other minorities. Hungary is home to Europe's third biggest Jewish population. But what are we to make of the accusations of anti-Semitism? What about the rise of the far right in Hungary? And how does this fit into the narrative of the far right in Europe? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Colm O'Kennedy. He's a reader-in-law at UCL, and he's a specialist in
Clearly, it was an offensive and divisive thing that the guy said, and the party is pretty upfront about being a right-wing Christian nationalist party. But that said, I think it's very important to start out understanding that the Jobbik party's primary sort of ethnic enemy, if there is one, is much more the Roma than the Jewish minority. It's a party that's based in the rural parts of the country out east where there are no Jews whatsoever, and it's really an issue of sort of poor whites coming face to face with this Roma minority.
When Viktor Orban addressed the World Jewish Congress, he didn't mention Jobbik, though. Do you think he's genuine when he says that Jews are safe there?
I think he believes that very much, and I have to say I'm not particularly spooked on behalf of the Jews that I know in town in any sort of real practice.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. The President of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz, says a newspaper misreported him, saying that, quote, Hungary wants to count the Jews. Mr. Schulz did strongly criticise an incident when a radical nationalist Jobbik MP proposed the drawing up of a list of Jewish lawmakers. However, it does highlight the growing debate over the rise of the far-right group Jobbik. A report out earlier this month said that on the rise were desecrated Jewish cemeteries, Nazi graffiti and verbal and physical attacks on Jews. The European Union's Parliament has criticised Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, for not speaking out against extremist riots.
Sense, there really isn't much violence, much more in other parts of Europe. I think for obvious reasons, people tend to focus on the situation here because you've got sort of Nazi-looking, right-wing white people. But as most of us should know, in Europe as a whole, when there is actual anti-Semitic violence, it doesn't tend to be sort of whites hitting Jews. It's Muslims. So I think it needs to be kept in that perspective that people are not, my Jewish friends, of whom I have many, are not afraid.
Markus Daisch, Jews in Hungary are not afraid.
Well, I'm slightly surprised to hear some of Eric's comments. I mean, obviously he's in Budapest and he knows the Jewish community there better than we do here from London, but certainly we've reported numerous cases of attacks and a lot of concern among the Jewish community.